We have a few other panelists here, as well as a bunch of folks who are attending. Quickly gonna check a few of our attendees, see if there's any other panelists I need to promote. Do that. Great, very excited to have you all attending. So again, I'll do some introductions. We'll have a few presentations, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. This is being recorded. We do plan to make the recording available on the Westford Town website, and also the presentation that will be used tonight. This is a follow-up and an updated version of a public information session we held last fall. That recording and slides are also on the town website. And I'll share my screen in just a second and show folks that website. So again, I also have some other panelists here. We have other members of the Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee, Tom leading the effort to get and share information. Also, we have Dylan Patel from DOER and Michael Rossi from Code Consultants. We appreciate you making time to present here. I am going to share my screen, go through a few slides, and then turn it over to Dylan and Michael. Again, we will be taking questions. You can put questions in the Q&A feature, and we will get to them at the end of the prepared slides. We also accept comments at this session. We might not share every comment submitted on this recording, but feel free to submit comments either on this recording or by email to us, the committee, so we can receive public feedback on our proposal to have this specialized energy code adopted at our annual town meeting next month. Okay, so with that, let me try to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully folks can see this, and what I'm sharing here is the town website and the page under the Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee where we have put information about the specialized energy code. So this is where there was a link to register for this info session tonight. We originally were going to be hybrid in person and Zoom, but with the weather, we moved it to totally virtual on Zoom. This Zoom session is being recorded, and we will post it on this website. I will scroll down and you'll see that the old information session and presentation has been posted on this website. We have some information about the code, how it will benefit Westford, and some other FAQs. So definitely refer folks to this website for information. Okay, one more presentation by me. I'd like to share a few slides just for folks to have some background. So here are a few slides about our Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee and why we're recommending that Westford adopt the specialized energy code. And let me see if I can do a little better slideshow. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, hopefully the slides are a little bigger here. So there was a climate resolution passed at our October 2020 town meeting. It adopted a net zero by 2050 for greenhouse gas emissions goal. It also charged our committee to guide the town to that goal. As part of that effort, we published a climate roadmap in 2021 that includes strategies consistent with the state of Massachusetts to pursue energy efficiency in buildings, transition buildings and vehicles away from fossil fuels, generally towards electrification, decarbonizing the energy supply, including getting more clean energy resources like renewables into the electricity supply, and sequestering carbon, including preserving natural resources like trees. We did an inventory and found that buildings are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Westford at about 60%. And the building code is the primary policy to impact new buildings. There are going to be new buildings built, and then they will likely be around for a very long time, including through 2050. So new buildings are the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this sector and reach our goal in 2050. And new construction really is the focus of this effort. One thing, how this will benefit Westford, this will help Westford meet its goal to be net zero by 2050 by reducing carbon emissions in the building sector. And it is expected to help lower some operating costs in that sector. This is an important step for Westford to be able to achieve the status of Massachusetts climate leader. That is an advanced version of the Green Communities program. And as a climate leader community, we would be eligible for additional state funding. As an example of that, Massachusetts just released its first grant funding amount for climate leaders last fall, and that was at a level of $60 million. If you'd like more information, again, you can go to our town website and contact myself or Beth or Tom, who are on our working group. So let me stop there. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dylan and Michael to give their presentation.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Mike. Excuse me. My name is Dylan Patel. I am the regional coordinator for the Green Communities program of the Department of Energy Resources. I serve the Northeast region, including the town of Westford. And I'm joined here with Michael Rossi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dylan. My name is Michael Rossi. I'm an energy code specialist with Performance Systems Development, also known as PSD. We provide energy code training and technical support to different leaders across Massachusetts. So thank you for having us.
And so we are going to present on the opt-in specialized code. Hopefully you can all see the slides in full screen. That's great. Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to get started with a little bit of the policy overview of the opt-in code, and then I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk a little bit about the details of the code itself. So we kind of began with the Climate Act of 2021. This was a landmark piece of legislation that was passed a few years ago that set legal limits on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the state of Massachusetts can emit by 2050, and indeed set a limit of net zero emissions by that year, with interim targets for the previous decades. The Climate Act also moved authority for the updates of the Stretch Energy Code from the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, BBRS, to the Department of Energy Resources. At the same time, it required DOER to come up with a specialized opt-in code that would be essentially a net zero code. It would be a code that would help Massachusetts with its new buildings achieve net zero emissions and therefore comply with the Climate Act of 2021. The reason why the specialized opt-in code is very important for the building sector is that new construction is going to account for a fairly large percentage of the building stock by 2050. We anticipate that with the growth in the state, just over a quarter of the building space will be new construction. And the best way to make those net zero is through building codes, by making sure that they are built the correct way. Because as you all understand, once a building is built, it is very difficult to renovate, retrofit. And therefore, if you can build it right, build it correctly the first time, we all save ourselves a lot of headache in the future. We also hope that by having this very ambitious energy code, we can create a market for new and emerging technologies. You may have heard a lot of news about the spread of ground source heat pumps, the new generation of cold climate air source heat pumps. These are technologies that are hyper efficient, that pair well with new construction, and therefore, once these become more commonplace, and there's more competition from the supply side in the market, it can then become more cost effective to do that with building retrofits. Another reason why the specialized stretch energy code is a net zero code is it really takes advantage of the electric sector and the changes to the electric sector that is happening in our state. Now, right now, the generation mix in the state of Massachusetts is fairly carbon intensive. In fact, we get a lot of our electricity right now from natural gas generation. So therefore, heating with traditional electric systems, so electric resistance, is actually a lot more carbon intensive than any form of fossil fuel that exists right now. Heat pumps, however, because they're much more energy efficient, you have air source heat pumps that are twice or thrice as much efficient. You have ground source heat pump systems that are 4 or 5 times more efficient than electric resistance. They're able to heat up a space with far lower electrical emissions from the grid because they require much lower electrical demand. And that translates to lower emissions, especially when you compare it to fossil fuels. Now, we want to take advantage of the fact that this is a dynamic situation. We expect a lot more renewable energy generation to be in the mix 25 years hence, with a lot more onshore and offshore wind, with a lot more solar penetration. And you may have had the news of Canadian hydro coming our way. So with that, we expect an electric grid that's much less carbon intensive in the future. And we can leverage that by electrifying our heating systems and other forms of drying and cooking and other building amenities. So with that, with air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, the electric emissions of heating up a space are comparatively negligible when you compare it to other traditional forms of heating. Mike Belinsky had mentioned the Climate Leaders Program. This is a new program that the Department of Energy Resources has launched last year, and it really builds on the great projects that many municipalities across the state, including Westford, have leaned on for energy efficiency and taking their first steps toward decarbonization. The Green Communities Program has been around for over a decade and will continue to be around. However, we acknowledge that many municipalities like Westford have had some great projects that they've implemented over time. In fact, Westford has received over $1.3 million in DOER funding since becoming a green community, doing a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency and reducing their carbon emissions. We can build on that through the Climate Leaders Program. And the specialized stretch code is one of the keys that can unlock eligibility into that program. And in fact, Westford already has, with Mike and Tom and Beth and a lot of other great people, already established an energy committee. As Mike had mentioned, you have already a municipal decarbonization commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. There's very few criteria to go to become a climate leader at this point. And so what are the rewards for becoming a climate leader? So we offer 2 types of funding available. One is technical assistance to the tune of $150,000 $100,000 that help with large, fairly in-depth technical studies that can lay the groundwork for capital-intensive decarbonization projects. This includes solar PV, solar thermal arrays, air source and ground source heat pumps, battery and other energy storage, and other decarbonization activities, for which we can provide up to $1 million in capital funding over 3 years. So you have some seed funding to help you figure out and find out what is feasible in your chosen area. And then you have $1 million that can be spent for the construction of such projects. Turning back to the code itself, and Michael will provide a lot more in-depth information on this. The specialized code basically exists as the pinnacle of a three-tier system of energy codes in the state of Massachusetts. We have this so that there is flexibility across the state, given the diverse array of populations, of building stocks, of capacities, so that municipalities can pick and choose how aggressive they want to be and how ambitious they want to be when it comes to energy efficiency. The specialized code essentially exists as the stretch code with some additional requirements. And it has been in existence, available to adopt for just over 2 years, since the beginning of 2023. And in that short time, there have already been 48 municipalities adopting it across the state, representing over a third of the state's population. And this is a map of those 48 municipalities that have adopted it, highlighted in blue and yellow outline. You'll see that there's a geographic diversity across the state. We have many in Western Mass interested in it. There are cities of different economic statuses, of different urbanisms, if you will, ranging from rural to highly densely urban environments. And you'll also notice that Westford has some neighbors that have already adopted the specialized stretch energy code, including Chelmsford, Carlisle, and Acton. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael to give more information on the specifics of the opt-in code.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dylan. So just to start off, you might be hearing us refer to the code in a few different ways tonight. Dylan said specialized code, opt-in code, things like that. So note that these phrases can be used interchangeably. So the actual code's called the Municipal Opt-in Specialized Code. So I might refer to it as opt-in code or specialized code. And when I'm talking about this is really what the topic of conversation is. Now, the code that Westford currently follows is the stretch code. So if I refer to it as the stretch code, that's what's currently the active energy code in the community. But if I refer to it as opt-in code or specialized code, that's what's under consideration to be adopted. So next slide, please. So here's some just quick fast facts about the specialized code. So the specialized code is only applicable for new buildings. Any existing home or historic home are not affected by it, so it only impacts new buildings. There are requirements in the stretch code that are applied to things like all electric homes or electric vehicle charging. And these requirements in the specialized code are the same. So if you're building a new all electric home, there's really no difference in what you're doing in the specialized code than what it would be under the stretch code. So there's nothing new to do for an all electric home, and the EV charging requirements that are in the stretch code are the same for the specialized code. There's nothing new there as well. Dylan mentioned some of the incentives that are available for energy efficient construction, primarily through the Green Communities Program and the Climate Leaders Program. And additionally, there's some other local incentives available through Mass Save and other rebates. There's a new 45L tax credit that's been extended to 2032 that is for buildings that build green construction to DOE Zero Energy Ready Home standards, or Energy Star standards. So there are incentives available for high performance construction here. And then there's also for multifamily build passive house certification. And as more communities are starting to adopt things like building performance standards, where they benchmark energy use over time and reduce the energy use over time, building new construction to a passive house standard, which I'll describe in more detail shortly, it can really help with emissions reductions. The code also does retain the choice to build with fossil fuels, so it doesn't particularly restrict you from using natural gas or propane, but what it'll do is add a couple additional provisions to the code that are required if you are using those fuels. And some of the provisions are related to pre-wiring for future electrification. So essentially installing a plug nearby any equipment that's currently using fossil fuels for space heating, water heating, cooking, and clothes drying for a future electric hookup for an equipment. So essentially having a dedicated outlet nearby any equipment using those fossil fuels so that it can easily be transitioned to an electric thing and not having to undergo the costs of a costly retrofit where you might have to poke holes in the walls after the fact. And you can sort of put those wires in early on in the process. And then there are also some requirements for mixed fuel buildings to install an on-site solar system of at least 4 kilowatts for smaller buildings, and actually enough to get to net zero for larger buildings over 4,000 square feet of heated floor space, or also known as conditioned floor area, to offset some of the emissions. So essentially, if you're building a new all-electric home, the requirements are the same as they are currently in the energy code. But if you're building a new home with any sort of natural gas or propane or fossil fuels, there are additional requirements to follow related to pre-wiring and adding a solar array to the project. Next slide, please. So yeah, so as I mentioned, all electric path, same as it would be under the stretch code, no additional changes. But if you're building a new home and choosing to include fossil fuels, also known as mixed fuel, there's the requirements of the stretch code that are applicable, plus some additional requirements that I previously mentioned. So it has to be electrification ready, also known as pre-wiring. And again, that's having an outlet nearby any equipment currently using fossil fuels for cooking, space heating, water heating, and clothes drying, as well as a requirement for a solar array where feasible. And as I said, that requirement for solar is to install a 4 kilowatt system for homes under 4,000 square feet. And then for larger luxury homes, there's a requirement for net zero. And that would essentially be enough solar installed on the home to offset the energy use of the project. So those are the requirements that are added as part of the mixed field buildings. We'll dig into that in more detail in the following slides too. So next slide, Dylan, please. Great. So one of the bases of the stretch code and the specialized code is this path for most projects that follow the HERS index, also known as the Home Energy Rating System. So what a HERS index is essentially I like to describe it as like a miles per gallon sticker for a car, but for a house, where the lower the HERS score, the more efficient the project is. So a HERS 100 is essentially equivalent to a new home that was constructed in 2006. Most existing homes in the state might fall around 140, 150, higher up. In Massachusetts in 2020 and 2021, the average HERS score was about a 51. And if you want to get a net zero home, or using both reducing the energy use of the project and a combination of that and solar, a HERS 0 or below is there. So the requirements for the stretch code and the specialized code, as you'll see on the farthest box on the right, are the same for the HERS index. So the stretch code and the specialized code requirements for new construction are 42. So that's not different between the two different codes, but we just wanted to call it out here because previously there was some overlap in terms of the requirements, but so I guess the main takeaways for HERS is that the lower the score, the more efficient the project. the code requirements for the HERS index are the same for both the stretch code and the specialized code. And it's essentially an index to measure the energy use of the project based on different features used in the home, including and not limited to like insulation, windows, any like the mechanical equipment used for space heating and water heating, your appliances. It factors in this how much insulation and window to wall area you have. It looks at orientations. It looks at other features like that, like how airtight the home is, how well air sealed the ducts are, and things like that. So really takes a comprehensive look of what the home performance would be before factoring in occupant behavior. Next slide, please. So the reason I mentioned the HERS is because this is sort of breaks down some of the differences between this specialized code. As I said, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, for all electric new homes, any size building, the requirements for the stretch code and the specialized code are the same, which is either achieving a HERS 45 or a passive house certification. And then additionally, for mixed fuel homes, if you're under 4,000 square feet, the requirements are HERS 42 plus a solar PV with a minimum of 4 kilowatts and that wiring for future electrification. And if it's over 4,000 square feet, the requirement can be a HERS 42 or passive house under the stretch code, but the specialized code also requires enough solar to get to net zero and wiring for electrification. And if you're going to use a passive house route, you don't have to do the solar, you just have to be wired for electrification and meet all the program requirements that are used for passive house. So what I would describe Passive House is a third-party certification program similar to the HERS, where you have to get certified Passive House to meet the code. And there's two options for Passive House certification. There's an American model, which is known as FIAS, formerly Passive House Institute US, as well as a European model, which is known as PHI, which is Passive House Institute, which is sort of a German European model for the analysis. And essentially, passive house buildings take into consideration a lot of the large aspects of building science and some of the most important features of it, like very well insulated and airtight, has really good ventilation strategies and moisture management, and is a very high performance building, but also a building that really factors in all the most important pieces of building science to have a really efficient home. So that's the requirements for all electric or mixed fuel for new construction. And then as we mentioned before, for home additions and alterations, the requirements under the specialized code are the same as they would be under the stretch code. There's nothing different there. And then historic homes might be exempt from the energy code if it can be shown that the complying with the code would damage the historic form, fabric, or function of the building. And for ADUs or accessory dwelling units, there are going to be some new requirements that are specifically dedicated to ADUs in an update to the stretch code that's likely to take effect in a couple months. So, or sorry, not in a couple months, couple weeks. So I think DOER is expecting a February 15th adoption of that specialized or of the update to the stretch code and the specialized code. And that actually puts the ADUs in a different sector than the new construction and additions and alterations. So it's sort of the requirements sort of between them for the HERS index. All right, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there is that requirement for that solar PV system for mixed fuel projects. So solar is required for mixed fuel buildings when there's a suitable solar roof zone of more than 300 square feet and the right orientation. So you want to make sure that the solar system you're installing is going to have the most opportunity to get solar on the site. If it's not going to be oriented effectively to gain that solar, it's not going to be required. And so the system can be ground mounted as long as it's on site. There is a opportunity, so you can either own the panels as the homeowner, or you could potentially lease the panels through a power purchase agreement, which is also allowed. And then the intent of the code isn't to have to cut down trees. So if there are obstructions to the home, from them, the solar requirement might not be required. And with that, the way that's spelled out in the code is that if the area is shaded for more than 70% of daylight hours annually, you're essentially obstructed for more than 70% of the time, the requirements don't apply. So you don't have to install that solar system. And then for all electric buildings, as I mentioned, there's no requirement to install solar PV, but they just have to have a requirement for solar ready roofs, which is the same as the stretch code. And what that is essentially making sure that if someone were to want to install a solar system in the future, that the building is adequately prepared for it, looking at the roof structural loads, the panel space, and having an area where they could route the conduit in the future. So just to recap what I said, so for on an electric home, there's no requirement for solar. For small mixed fuel homes that are under 4,000 square feet, you have to have a 4 kilowatt requirement for solar unless the building's built to passive house. If it's a larger luxury home that's over 4,000 square feet, you have to install enough solar to get to net zero. And essentially the way that's shown is you have to have a HERS score prior to solar and after solar. And after factoring in solar, the HERS score actually has to be a 0 or below when it's over that threshold. And then for other residential buildings, the requirements are similar to the commercial of 0.75 watts per square feet. And that might be different types of buildings that aren't just the like not single family, but might be more like the R2 or R3
Like a
types.
duplex. Yeah.
Yeah, a duplex or things there. And then additionally for commercial buildings, the requirements are for 1.5 watts per square feet of the 3 largest floors. And then for buildings that are highly ventilated, the requirements are a little bit different, where there's 0.5 watts per square feet of the 3 largest floors as well. So yeah, that just digs into a little bit more detail into the solar specific requirements here. All right, so one thing that we had questions about previously when we've given this presentation before is some of the costs associated with investing in the opt-in code. So this slide here actually shows some of the costs that would be there for a all-electric building. So when you're building an all-electric building, as you can see, there's really no cost associated with building to the specialized code when compared to the stretch code. And that's because the requirements are the same. So there's no additional costs here. But in the next slide, we'll look at some of the costs that are associated for a new building that is natural gas. So some of the costs you have to think about are the costs to pre-wire the home. And that cost is around $4,000. And then there's also the factor of solar, of adding that 4 kilowatt solar array. And that's actually around $14,000 or $15,000 there. But there's also some significant rebates that go along with the installation of the solar system that are about like $5,500, which means that the total cost for the solar is only going to add about $10,000 to the project. And then, so the total additional costs are going to be around a little over $13,000, but there's also going to be some annual energy bill savings from installing the system of over $1,482 as well. So it's something where, although there is high upfront costs, you will be seeing those savings in your energy bills as well. All right, and then for large buildings, as we said, that's going to be buildings over 4,000 square feet. Same situation with the electric, where there's really no cost differences because the requirements are the same as they would be under the stretch code. And then for large natural gas projects, the pre-wiring cost is going to be a little bit more expensive because you have to factor in larger area of the space. So we're estimating around a $9,000 cost for that. And then the solar cost is going to be a little bit more too, because instead of installing 4 kilowatts, you have to install enough to get to 0. And for the project that was modeled in this scenario, the solar cost was around $23,000, but with around $8,000 of rebates. So the difference in the cost is about $15,000. And So the total added cost, if you're going to build a large new natural gas building or with propane, is going to be around 24,000 total, with $2,273 in annual energy savings. So, and again, these are typically the larger luxury homes and that are only choosing to build with those gas systems here. So I'll also note that there are a lot of really great incentives available, both through the Mass Save program and through the federal 45L tax credit that I mentioned earlier. And so some of these incentives include for meeting requirements under the HERS requirement. If you meet a HERS 46 or the HERS scores below 46, which is typically what it is under the code, you get a $15,000 incentive for a single family project. And if the project's HERS 36 or lower, that actually goes up to $25,000 with some additional requirements baked in as well. Then for the 45L tax credit, if you're building to an Energy Star, that's $2,500. And if you're building to Zero Energy Ready Home, that's around $5,000. So a lot of really good money available on the single family side that you could get by building to some of the requirements of the code. In some situations, it's beyond the code, but for some of the situations noted here, because a 45 is required for a new all-electric building, that incentive of $15,000 is essentially given for meeting the code, but there are a couple of things you have to do on top of it that go beyond it. And that's related to like air sealing and things like that that might go beyond the code, but are still in line with the program requirements. But we'll refer to the specific program requirements for more there. For multifamilies, buildings, I'm sorry, go back one slide, Dylan. So for multifamily projects, there are some incentives that are available as well. And there are some really good solar incentives that are there too. So through the federal tax credit through 2032, you get 30% of the system back. There's the 15% state tax credit available as well, up to $1,000. There's some programs available for net metering and smart. And then there's no sales tax on them or no extra property tax on added value to the home. So yeah, so that's just a little bit of some of the incentives that are available to build to these program requirements. All right, so here's where the requirements are a little bit more stringent, and that's actually for large or multifamily projects that are over 12,000 square feet. So under the stretch code, there was 3 compliance paths that are available. There was building to HERS, passive house, or this other model that's available for commercial buildings called thermal energy demand intensity, or TEDI. In the specialized code, 2 of those paths are no longer allowed for multifamily buildings that are 4 stories or above over 12,000 square feet. And those projects are now required to be built to passive house standards. And so the big projects have to be certified passive house under the specialized code for all electric. And then for mixed fuel, there is that requirement for passive house along with electrification ready, which is that pre-wiring requirement we talked about of having a dedicated outlet nearby any equipment currently using fossil fuels for the future installation of electric equipment. All right, so and this actually says what I just said in a little different ways. So as I mentioned, under the stretch code, there's 3 pathways for compliance: that HERS, that TEDI, or the passive house. But the specialized code requires passive house certification for these new multifamily buildings over 12,000 square feet. All right, so a little bit more about Passive House, just to lay the groundwork for anyone that just doesn't know. So Passive House, again, is a third-party building verification program with 2 certifications for compliance, FIAS and PHI. So these certifications set energy performance and building envelope air tightness requirements, and can be any type of building. So even though it says Passive House, it could still apply for office buildings or high-rise, low-rise, multifamily housing, single family. Really any building can be factored in there. And it does not require all electric or net zero. So Passive House still can use, so there's different standards that you can meet for Passive House. There's FIAS Core, FIAS Zero, but typically with like a requirement like FIAS Core, you might not be required to be all electric or net zero. It's just building with the design considerations in mind. And the reason why passive house are so good is because the heating loads can be reduced by 90% or more compared to a typical building. And the overall energy demand can be reduced by 60% or more. And With it, there's a significant improvement in indoor air quality and occupant comfort because you're having so little air leakage from the home and so little air is escaping from it that I've heard passive houses to be described in a way where you can heat the whole building with an air dryer in the winter because of how it like or with a hair dryer in the winter just because of how insulated they are. So that's just a little bit about it. And that's just one project in particular, but I'm sure there's applies elsewhere too. So that's not applicable in all cases, but typically, as I said, very well insulated, very high performance, and very low heating load for these buildings. All right, so there are questions that have been raised around affordable housing and passive house, but we find them to be a great mix. And part of that's because you're going to have lower utility costs for tenants and the developer, better indoor air quality because you're building a home with all those principles of building science in mind, which lead to lower health impacts from indoor pollutants. So you might have less cases of asthma or less or no mold and mildew accumulation that you might get in a typical unit. It improves occupant comfort as well because there's a consistent room temperature and elimination of air drafts. And a big thing with the passive is because it's designed so well that the construction lasts longer and there's less maintenance needs and costs associated with the building because the systems in the building are able to perform as designed rather than having to oversize a system that breaks down quicker or undersizing a system that doesn't meet the requirements. So because of the way these projects are designed, there's typically better occupant safety and comfort there. All right, and for multifamily buildings, passive house is actually becoming more common. In so currently there's over 13,000 units of multifamily housing pursuing passive house certification in Massachusetts, and over a third of these projects are categorized as low income projects, and the rest are market rate housing. So, yeah, so over 13,000 projects right now are currently enrolled to be passive house. So that's a really big milestone in the state, and I'm sure that it's going to continue as some of these code provisions take effect and as more communities adopt this specialized code. All right, so we talked a little bit about the single family incentives that are available, but here's some multifamily incentives that are also available for meeting some of these program requirements. So passive house apartments are actually awarded 8 points in the low income housing tax credit applications. And projects that are eligible for Energy Star or Zero Energy Ready Home must get these certifications to get passive house certified. So essentially, it's something where you're building on the program requirements with passive house because these buildings have to be certified Energy Star or Zero Energy Homes. So you have those sort of building blocks to be eligible for a lot of really great incentives that are out there. And low operating costs as well is another big piece of it. So I think that's it for the specific questions, or for the presentation. I'll turn it back to Dylan and we can open up for some questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, as Michael was mentioning, we have some extra additional slides that we have put into the appendix, but we would rather turn it back to Mike Galinsky and Tom and the audience so that we can focus on particular pieces of information from the audience. And thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dylan and Michael. Really appreciate that information. Great resource. And again, this recording and the slides will be put up on the town website. I did have some comments and maybe some questions to start the Q&A and discussion. And I encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A feature of this Zoom. You can also submit comments, and we are happy to receive comments as well. Comments may or may not get shared on this session right now, but we appreciate feedback. One question I had was on the cost data, both the upfront cost and then the operating cost savings. I did a quick calculation and it seemed like the payback period, very simple analysis, would have been maybe 9 to 11 years, so maybe about a 10-year payback. Does that sound right on that order of magnitude?
Yeah, so that sounds about right, based upon the models that PSD have run. It's going to obviously vary on a case by case basis. The pre-wiring requirement, for example, may be higher or lower depending on how many appliances you actually have to pre-wire for. Um, and and the most important thing is that the solar industry is in a very dynamic state right now. There are opposing factors going on, both in terms of trade policy, but also with the fact that domestic solar production, uh, domestic solar module production, is increasing a lot right now, and so the with much greater solar penetration, as we've seen in the last 15 odd years, there have been steep declines in the price of solar. Obviously, some of that have been offset right now with trade frictions, and supply chain bottlenecks. But that's just a small blip in the road. And the next decade or so, we anticipate much further reductions in the upfront cost of solar.
Yeah, and I agree with Dylan on there, in that it is pretty variable, just depending on other factors like inflation has caused some like higher construction costs. Energy costs can be pretty volatile sometimes, so there's the cost of energy might fluctuate, and because of that, it's hard to really get a good estimate. But and there are factors like that that we have to think about when doing this, like different changing construction costs, energy costs, things like that that might come with different market variables.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you. And what should we use as like a rule of thumb for the life of these buildings? Could it be 50 years or longer? Just to put it in sort of perspective to like a 10 or so year payback. I'm thinking that, the life of a building is gonna be much longer than a 10-year period.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that makes sense. I think 30 to 50 years is a typical like useful life of a building time. But obviously that's going to depend on other factors like if someone's passing a home on to their kids, if they're going to buy the home and then sell it right away, things like that. So the useful life really depends, but I'd say 30 to 50 years would make sense for there.
I agree with Michael.
Yeah,
And there are just two things that I wanted to add to that is that, the payback, in a sense, yes, is in a financial term, but also in a carbon accounting term. Like, these buildings are going to last no matter who occupies them, 50, maybe 100 years. We have houses right now that are 100 years old. And so, getting them to net zero, you're eliminating 100 years worth of carbon emissions, based on the increment of what it would have been if you built it to the stretch code. So that's you have a financial payback, you also have an environmental payback. The second, and Michael alluded to this, is that with solar and with the pre-wiring, um, you're making your house more marketable. And so there you'll have a value added to that house, which makes it much more desirable place to live in. The pre-wiring requirement, yes, is an upfront cost, but it will always be less than having to do it post facto. So having to tear down Michael alluded to this right in the beginning, having to tear down the walls if you're putting in a heat pump or an induction stove 10 to 20 years down the line. So we mark this is really a consumer protection measure so that future homeowners can actually save money down the line.
Yeah, agreed. And as some of these other appliances that Dylan mentioned, like an induction stove or something, become more popular in the marketplace and common and cheaper and things like that, there's going to be a higher demand for the products. And then having a home that's already equipped to meet that demand with the outlet in place nearby is a really important step too. So as we see, because the useful life is going to be so long, 30 to 50 years, those pre-wiring requirements will be great because if these induction stove prices say have in 10 years or so, which they might as technology improves, that those types of changes can actually and as they sort of flood the market and as like maybe gas stoves become less popular or common, you're already prepared without having to undergo a costly retrofit of removing drywall and trying to wire through existing homes, you already have in place ahead of time. So I agree with Dylan that consumer protection here is a big piece of this.
Yeah, thanks for that. That makes sense. I did want to switch gears a little bit to some Westford specific questions. One that comes to mind is when might this be implemented? So I did want to address that. So we have our annual town meeting, March 22nd, where this is currently on the warrant. So there is a draft article, and that's been posted as part of a select board meeting material from recent select board meetings. So you can check out the draft town meeting agenda. And what our proposal has been is if this passes at this spring town meeting, it'll be implemented no sooner than January 1st, 2026. So that'll be like 8 months later. So this is our proposal. It is in line with guidance from DOER. So if it passes at this annual town meeting, it would go into place no earlier than January 1st, 2026. And that is our suggestion, to give folks time to adapt, but also to get it in place as soon as possible in order to achieve all these benefits that we've been talking about tonight. Tom or Beth, did you want to add anything else about the Westford specific experience with the adoption and implementation of the code? Beth, you're muted if you're trying to share.
One of the concerns here in Westford is the grid and whether or not the grid is going to be able to handle this type of electrification. And Dylan, I noticed that you, in your supplemental area, had grid slides, and I'm wondering if you could just cover what about the grid? And can it handle this?
Yes, just give me 1 second, just making sure it's all up. Okay. Oh, all right from the beginning. So there are kind of 2 considerations, 2 slides that I put in on where the grid is going and how the specialized opt-in code may impact the grid. So number 1, I think there has been kind of concern outside of energy code discussions just in the way that the grid is going. One, because of the growing share of renewable penetration, grid outages, the rise of electric consumption after so long, with new economic growth, with AI industries, and so kind of with all of those kind of factors in mind, DOER with other stakeholders, with other working groups, have launched what's known as the GMAC, the Grid Modernization Advisory Council. And the GMAC is a committee that kind of works with the investor-owned utilities, National Grid, Eversource, Unitil, to develop what's known as energy sector modernization plans. The 3 main utilities submit these to the Department of Public Utilities, and it is a long-term plan for how each utility plans to invest to increase the strength and capacity of its grid. Now, National Grid has outlined over $2 billion of investment within the next few years that will modernize, or that plans to modernize the capacity of its substations and have distribution upgrades so that it's able to handle both extra electrical load from buildings, increase distributed energy systems such as solar, as well as increase the reliability of the grid during extreme weather events. Now, anyone can actually participate in public meetings. These are held monthly. And any developer who may be concerned about the capacity of the grid is open to attend these meetings. The second point that I wanted to make is that the way that we have designed the stretch and specialized code is that they really should be considered as thermal codes. Now, the reason being is that, as Michael was mentioning during the explanation of the specialized code, they're designed to make houses so airtight, so well insulated that the heating needs are much lower than what would be under the base code, for example. And you have even higher savings when building to passive house, especially when you're building to passive house apartments, because obviously you have that residential density. When you compare it to the stretch energy code, the passive house literally crushes your heating and cooling demand such that you're able to downsize your heating equipment so that your peak load is less. The equipment itself is not on as often because it doesn't need to be. Um, and in some cases, the building can just be kept warm. Michael mentioned a hairdryer. The sun, even in the winter, and people's own body heat, have been able to warm up environments within passive house buildings. So the electrical demand that comes from building passive house apartments, it would be actually much lower under the specialized code than it would be under the stretch code.
Great, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for raising that, Beth. That is something that's been raised. We're interested in, and we're engaging with our utility national grid on those type of issues. Yeah, okay. There is a question from the audience. I'd like to address that. So I want to confirm, right now Westford has the stretch code. So when the state other entities change the stretch code, Westford has to accept those changes, right? And continue to follow the stretch code. And then the same question for the specialized code. If we adopt the specialized code, might we expect changes to the specialized code, in which case we'll have to accept those changes?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. So that's correct. When the stretch code changes or the specialized code changes, by adopting it, you will have to accept all future things. You could rescind it. You could rescind it if you feel as though it's getting there. But my thought on this is that changes don't always have to be increasing stringency. One of the updates to the stretch code that's actually coming out in a week or so is actually decreasing some of the stringency in response to some public feedback and stakeholder feedback on the code. So some of the design challenges that were brought from the stretch code actually had been incorporated into some of these updates to make the requirements a little bit less stringent in some instances and providing more flexibility to designers based on challenges that were identified. So I'd say that when it comes down to updates and modifications to the code, they don't always have to be making it harder to comply. Sometimes they actually add flexibility there and help alleviate some of the burdens that are there. So for example, in the update coming soon, there's actually going to be a really big change in the stretch code itself for existing buildings where they're actually decreasing the stringency of the HERS index very significantly. In the code right now, for a mixed fuel HERS index requirement for an existing building alteration or addition over 1,000 square feet, the requirement's meeting a 52. They're actually bumping that up to a 65 for a large addition or alteration there. So that's actually going to be a pretty significant change that is in response to feedback they've received. So I'd say when it comes to some of the specifics, DUER really does a good job listening to challenges that have been identified with the code. So if there's anything that's been proposed that might be like considered too stringent or something, they could work to help make edits and adjustments. And some of these changes that come about are also just based on code cycles that come. So there's a new model code that's published every 3 years on the national level. So when that code gets published, sometimes the code update might just be to better align with the latest version of that code as well. So to that, I'll speak to that. I don't know if Dylan might have some more to add as well. Thanks.
No, Michael, you answered that perfectly. To John's specific points, we don't have thoughts on what future changes might look like. But as Michael had mentioned, the state of Massachusetts usually follows the 3-year cycle and has extensive public outreach to put in Massachusetts-specific amendments. It works with diverse arrays of stakeholders, including the building industry, architects, clean energy advocates, to make sure that there is a well-balanced approach. To the point about whether requiring existing houses to retrofit to new standards, I cannot speak to that at this point in time.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that. Thanks for the question. I did have another Westford specific question. What about the Westford Library project? How might that be impacted if we adopt the specialized code at this town meeting? Beth or Tom, can you speak to that specific current Westford project?
I'm on the committee that is working on the library expansion, and that will not be affected by this because it is an expansion. It is not a new building. And also any projects like the library that are already in process are going to come in before the date of January 1st, 2026. But the library absolutely would not be affected by this. It's all electric. The other great thing about the library is that it is all electric. So it wouldn't be affected because of that also.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah, and speaking to that in particular, I think the way the language is that it's for buildings permitted after the date of adoption. So
Yeah.
it would take effect for buildings that are permitted after January 1st, 2026, if that's how you're doing it.
Great. Thanks for mentioning that. Okay. One other topic that has come up in the past is accessory dwelling units. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that or share some slides on that, because that has come up in different forums.
Sure. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, in this update to the stretch code that's actually going to be coming in a week, there were some changes to the requirements for accessory dwelling units. So, Dylan actually has them listed here. So, the HERS index requirements previously for ADUs was the same as they were for new construction, but they actually lack some of those requirements in the new update. So, if you're building a new ADU that's mixed fuel, the requirement is a HERS 52. If you're building an all-electric project or a mixed fuel building with solar installed, it's a 55. And if you do both solar and a PV system in that ADU, the requirements are HERS 58. So when a HERS rating can be done on an ADU, like as tested as a separate dwelling unit, it doesn't matter if it's attached or detached. A rating can be done just on that ADU space. So when you're looking at something like an addition, and again, this is in the stretch code, not in the specialized code, because specialized code doesn't have any impacts on additions. When you're doing an addition, for example, you'd have to rate the existing portion of the house and that addition space. But for an ADU, you can just rate the ADU space and not the rest of the home that it might be attached to if it's there. And that's because there's a separate living space primarily for that dwelling. So that has a kitchen, a bathroom, privacy bedroom. So typical requirements of an ADU are also there. So
Thank you. I did want to just clarify, how would Westford adopting the specialized code affect ADUs going forward?
So
So
the
it would
requirements
not.
are the same as they would be under the stretch code. And Dylan, and you were chiming in, so I'll let you.
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries.
Yeah, no, it would not.
Okay,
Essentially.
great. Just want to make sure that's out there. Okay, thank
Yep.
you. Great. Okay, I think that was all that I had covered. I don't see any current questions. Beth, Tom, anything else you wanted to raise?
No, I think we're in good shape.
Okay, so we'll conclude the session then. Again, thank you so much to Dylan and Michael and Beth and Tom for participating, presenting information, answering questions. Again, this recording will be made available on the Westford Town website as well as the presentation. Thanks also to town staff and the Westford Town Manager's Office for originally setting up this Zoom and helping get the word out. Thanks everybody for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you at our town meeting. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you.